Welcome to another episode of Serial Killer Files by Skoob, the podcast that dives deep into the most chilling true crime cases that have haunted our communities. I'm your host, Arthur Morgan, and today we're exploring a case that terrorized the Jersey Shore in the early 1980s, the story of Richard Biegenwald, a man whose name still sends shivers down the spines of those who remember his reign of terror. This isn't just another murder case. This is the story of a man who killed not for money, not for revenge, but for something far more disturbing: the pure thrill of watching life drain from his victim's eyes. Today, we'll journey through the twisted mind of the thrill killer and uncover how a troubled child became one of New Jersey's most notorious serial killers. To understand Richard Biegenwald, we need to go back to the beginning, to August 24, 1940, in Staten Island, New York. But this wasn't a story that began with hope or promise. From the moment Richard drew his first breath, he was born into a world that seemed determined to break him. Picture, if you will, a small house filled with the constant smell of alcohol and the sound of violence. Richard's father, Joseph Biegenwald, wasn't just a heavy drinker. He was a violent alcoholic who regularly used his young son as a punching bag. This wasn't occasional discipline gone too far. This was systematic abuse that created an environment where a small child never felt safe in his own home. By the age of 5, and I want you to really think about how young 5 years old is, Richard was already showing signs that something fundamental had broken inside him. One afternoon, he took matches and tried to burn down the family home. This wasn't a child playing with fire out of curiosity. This was a desperate cry for help from a boy whose world had already taught him that destruction was a normal response to pain. Instead of receiving the psychological help he desperately needed, Richard was shipped off to a psychiatric center in Rockland County. Imagine being 5 years old, already traumatized by abuse, and then being taken away from everything familiar and placed in a clinical, institutional setting. This was his first taste of being treated as a problem to be managed rather than a child who needed healing. But the system wasn't done with him yet. By age 8, Richard was already drinking alcohol and gambling, replicating the destructive patterns he'd witnessed at home. At 9 years old, he was sent to Bellevue Hospital in New York City, where he underwent something that would haunt him for the rest of his life: electroshock therapy. This was the late 1940s, an era when doctors believed they could reset a troubled child's brain by sending high-voltage electricity coursing through it. Under the direction of Dr. Loretta Bender, children as young as 3 were subjected to this barbaric treatment. For Richard, already struggling with the trauma of abuse, this procedure likely caused irreversible damage to his developing brain's capacity for empathy and impulse control. After the horrors of Bellevue, Richard wasn't returned to a normal childhood. Instead, he was funneled into the State Training School for Boys in Warwick, New York, essentially a reform school for young criminals. The staff there noted that he was a constant source of trouble, frequently caught stealing and trying to convince other boys to help him escape. Even more disturbing was his behavior during visits with his mother. Instead of using these rare opportunities to reconnect, Richard would wait for her to look away, so he could steal money from her purse. This showed a complete absence of normal family bonds. His moral compass wasn't just broken, it had never been built in the first place. Perhaps the most chilling incident of his youth occurred when he was 11 years old. In a moment of either extreme self-hatred or a desperate search for a sensation he could control, Richard deliberately set himself on fire while at his mother's house. This act of self-immolation revealed 2 terrifying aspects of his developing psyche. He had an abnormally high tolerance for pain, and he viewed life, including his own, as something cheap and disposable. By 16, Richard had managed to graduate from 8th grade, which was required for his release from the training school. He tried enrolling in regular high school, but after years of institutionalization, he couldn't adapt to normal structure. He dropped out after just a few weeks. Without school or legitimate work to occupy him, Richard turned to what he knew best: crime and wandering. In 1957, he headed south to Nashville, Tennessee, where he spent 2 years drifting through society's margins. It was during this period that he committed a federal offense by stealing a car and driving it across state lines. When federal agents finally caught him in Kentucky in 1958 and sent him back to New York, Richard was 18 years old and fully radicalized by his experiences. He was no longer just a troubled boy with a fascination for fire. He had become a young man with complete disregard for human life. December 1958 marked a turning point that would define the rest of Richard Biegenwald's life. At 18 years old, he stole a car in Staten Island and drove to Bayonne, New Jersey with an accomplice. Their target was a small grocery store, a robbery that seemed routine until Richard pulled the trigger. Stephen Sladowski wasn't just a store owner. He was an attorney and assistant city prosecutor, a man who represented the very laws that Richard had spent his life breaking. When Richard shot and killed Sladowski during the robbery, he crossed a line that there was no coming back from. After the shooting, Richard fled the state, leading police on a multi-state chase that finally ended in Maryland with a dramatic shootout. When he was captured, it marked the end of his early life and the beginning of his career as a convicted killer. Richard was brought back to New Jersey, where he was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. For 17 long years, from 1958 to 1975, he remained behind bars. But prison didn't rehabilitate Richard Biegenwald, it merely contained him. In 1975, the parole board made a decision that would have devastating consequences for multiple innocent people. After 17 years in prison, Richard Biegenwald was released on parole. At 35 years old, he stepped back into a world that had changed dramatically since his incarceration. For a brief moment, it seemed like Richard might actually attempt to live a normal life. He took odd jobs and tried to keep a low profile, perhaps understanding that his freedom hung by a thread. But trouble had a way of finding Richard Biegenwald, or perhaps more accurately, he had a way of finding trouble. The warning signs appeared quickly. He failed to report to his parole officer regularly. In 1977, just 2 years after his release, he was suspected of rape. Then, in 1980, he was arrested again, though he was released when a victim couldn't positively identify him. Despite these red flags, Richard managed to marry a much younger woman and settle in Asbury Park, New Jersey. To outsiders, he might have appeared to be a man trying to rebuild his life. But the violence that had been simmering inside him since childhood had never really gone away. It had just been waiting for the right moment to resurface. And that moment was coming soon. Between 1981 and 1982, the Jersey Shore region became hunting grounds for a predator unlike any they had seen before. Richard Biegenwald had evolved from an angry young man committing crimes of opportunity into something far more sinister, a killer who murdered not for money or revenge, but for the pure excitement of taking a life. This is what made Richard Biegenwald so terrifying. His victims were chosen not because of who they were, but simply because they were available. Psychologists call this type of killer a hedonistic thrill killer, someone who murders because the rush of power and control they feel during the act becomes an addiction. Take the case of 18-year-old Anna Olasiewicz. On a busy evening at the Asbury Park Boardwalk, a place where families came to enjoy summer nights, Anna was approached by a seemingly harmless middle-aged man. Biegenwald somehow convinced her to get into his car, and once she was isolated, he shot her 4 times in the head. There was no personal connection between them. Anna hadn't wronged Richard in any way. Prosecutors would later argue that he was simply hunting for someone to kill that night. driven by a twisted need to experience the power of ending a human life. The most chilling aspect of Biegenwald's psychology was his complete detachment from normal human emotions. After murdering Anna, he didn't flee in panic or show signs of remorse. Instead, he calmly disposed of her body and went about his life as if nothing had happened. This casual attitude toward murder extended to how he treated his victims after death. He would hide bodies in his garage like trophies, even showing them to acquaintances. In one horrifying instance, he gave one of his victims' rings to a friend as a gift, treating the jewelry as a casual memento rather than evidence of a devastating crime. Richard Biegenwald's methods were as terrifying as they were unpredictable. Unlike serial killers who develop elaborate rituals or stick to specific victim types, Biegenwald's modus operandi was characterized by its randomness and brutality. His weapon of choice was typically a gun, and his preferred target was the head, multiple shots fired at close range. But he wasn't consistent even in this. Some victims were stabbed, others shot and then dismembered. The variation suggests that the method was less important to him than the act itself. Consider the case of William Ward, a prison escapee and drug dealer who crossed paths with Biegenwald in September 1982. Ward was shot 3 or 4 times in the head and buried in a remote location near Neptune City. Again, there was no clear motive beyond Biegenwald's desire to kill. 2 17-year-old girls, Mariah Chialela and Deborah Osborne, suffered even more horrific fates. After killing them, Biegenwald dismembered their bodies and buried them in shallow graves in his mother's yard on Staten Island. The casual way he used his childhood home as a dumping ground shows how completely he had divorced himself from normal human feelings. Betsy Bacon, another young woman, simply disappeared in late 1982. While her body was never found, investigators believe she too fell victim to Biegenwald's inexplicable need for violence. What made these crimes particularly chilling was their seemingly random nature. Biegenwald didn't appear to stalk his victims for weeks or months. Instead, he seemed to strike when opportunity presented itself, approaching victims in public places like the Asbury Park Boardwalk and somehow convincing them to isolate themselves with him. The locations where he disposed of bodies were equally haphazard: wooded lots behind businesses, shallow graves near a Burger King, remote areas in Neptune City. This lack of planning might suggest disorganization, but investigators came to understand that for Biegenwald, the disposal was just an afterthought. The real focus was always on the kill itself. By late 1982 and early 1983, law enforcement in Monmouth County was dealing with a growing list of missing persons and unexplained deaths. Young people were disappearing from popular areas like the Asbury Park Boardwalk, and when bodies were found, they showed signs of brutal execution-style killings. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source, a tip from someone who knew Biegenwald personally. A friend of his wife contacted police with a story so horrific that it initially seemed almost unbelievable. She told investigators that Biegenwald had once shown her a young woman's body hidden in his garage, treating it like some kind of macabre trophy. Even more disturbing, he had given her one of the victim's rings as a gift. This revelation transformed Biegenwald from a potential person of interest into the prime suspect in multiple murders. Police began working around the clock to trace his movements and connect him to the missing and murdered victims in the area. The investigation revealed that Biegenwald wasn't working alone. Living with him and his wife was a man named Darren Fitzgerald, a former prison acquaintance who had become deeply involved in Biegenwald's crimes. Fitzgerald had not only witnessed murders, but had actively helped dispose of bodies, including transporting victims to burial sites. As police built their case, they discovered that Biegenwald's crimes extended far beyond what they had initially suspected. The man they were tracking wasn't just responsible for a few random killings. He was a serial killer whose body count was still being calculated. On January 22, 1983, investigators decided they had enough evidence to move in. Police surrounded Biegenwald's Asbury Park home, where he was living with his wife and Darren Fitzgerald. Using a carefully planned ruse, they convinced Biegenwald to step outside, where he was immediately arrested. Fitzgerald was taken into custody as well. What police found when they searched the property was like something out of a horror movie. The house contained a massive cache of weapons that suggested Biegenwald had been planning even more violence. Handguns, rifles, shotguns, and even a machine gun were discovered, along with pipe bombs and various illegal drugs, including rohypnol, a sedative often associated with predatory crimes. Perhaps most disturbing were the floor plans of local residences and businesses found among his possessions, suggesting that he had been actively planning future attacks. Police even discovered a live puff adder snake and venom-collecting equipment, revealing a morbid fascination with death that extended beyond human victims. But the real breakthrough came when investigators began questioning Darren Fitzgerald. Under pressure, Fitzgerald began to reveal the full scope of Biegenwald's crimes. He admitted that Biegenwald had shown him bodies hidden in their garage and that he had personally helped transport victims to burial sites. Most crucially, Fitzgerald agreed to lead police to where the bodies were buried. What followed was one of the most grim and extensive body recovery operations in New Jersey history. With Darren Fitzgerald as their guide, investigators began the horrific process of locating Biegenwald's victims. The trail led them to multiple locations across New Jersey and Staten Island. Near a Burger King in Ocean Township, they found remains that had been hastily buried in shallow graves. Outside Neptune City, more bodies were discovered, some showing signs of having been dismembered before burial. Perhaps most shocking was the discovery at Biegenwald's mother's house on Staten Island. In the yard of this seemingly ordinary suburban home, police uncovered the remains of Maria Scialella and Deborah Osborne, both just 17 years old when they died. The casual way Biegenwald had used his childhood home as a dumping ground showed a complete disconnect from normal human emotions. As each body was recovered and identified, the full scope of Biegenwald's crimes became clear. Investigators were able to confirm at least 5 murders, though they suspected he was responsible for more. Each victim had been killed with shocking brutality. Multiple gunshot wounds to the head were common, along with signs of dismemberment and hasty disposal. The evidence was overwhelming. Ballistic tests linked bullets found in victims to weapons discovered in Biegenwald's home. Fitzgerald's detailed testimony provided a roadmap to the crime scenes. Most damning of all was the sheer callousness with which Biegenwald had treated his victims' remains, storing bodies like trophies and giving away their belongings as casual gifts. In 1983, Richard Biegenwald faced trial for multiple counts of first-degree murder. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who killed not out of passion or desperation, but for the simple pleasure he derived from ending human lives. The testimony was devastating. Prosecutors told the jury that in the murder of Anna Olesiewicz, Biegenwald had specifically told others that he wanted to watch someone die. This wasn't a crime of opportunity or a robbery gone wrong. This was premeditated murder committed solely for the psychological satisfaction it gave the killer. Darren Fitzgerald's testimony was particularly damning. He described in detail how Biegenwald had shown him bodies, involved him in disposal efforts, and spoken casually about the murders as if they were routine activities. The picture that emerged was of a man completely divorced from normal human empathy. The evidence was so overwhelming that the jury had little difficulty reaching their verdict. Biegenwald was convicted on multiple counts of first-degree murder. Initially, he was sentenced to death for the killing of Anna Olesiewicz, making him one of the first people to receive a death sentence in New Jersey after the state reinstated capital punishment. However, the death sentence would prove to be temporary. Years later, Biegenwald's death sentence was overturned by the New Jersey Supreme Court on technical grounds. Eventually, when New Jersey abolished the death penalty altogether, his sentence was commuted to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the families of his victims, the legal proceedings provided some measure of closure, but the pain of their losses would last forever. These weren't just statistics in a criminal case. They were young people with their whole lives ahead of them, cut down by a man who saw human life as nothing more than entertainment. Richard Biegenwald would spend the remaining 25 years of his life in New Jersey State Prison in Trenton. Unlike some killers who use their time in prison to seek redemption or express remorse, there's no evidence that Biegenwald ever showed genuine regret for his actions. Prison officials described him as a difficult inmate who never fully adapted to institutional life, despite having spent so much of his existence behind bars. The violence that had driven him to kill never seemed to leave him, though the controlled environment of maximum security prevented him from acting on those impulses. On March 10, 2008, at the age of 67, Richard Biegenwald died in his cell from respiratory and kidney failure. His death marked the end of a life that had been defined by violence from its earliest moments to its final breath. But while Biegenwald's death brought a certain closure, the trauma he inflicted on his victims' families and the Jersey Shore community would last much longer. The parents who lost their teenage daughters, the friends who watched their companions disappear into the night, the law enforcement officers who had to process such senseless brutality, all of them carried scars that would never fully heal. As we reach the end of Richard Biegenwald's story, we're left to grapple with some uncomfortable questions. How does a 5-year-old boy who tries to burn down his house become a serial killer who murders for thrills? Was his fate sealed by the abuse and failed treatments of his childhood, or were there moments when different interventions might have changed his path? The case of Richard Biegenwald serves as a stark reminder of how childhood trauma, when combined with systemic failures and a lack of appropriate intervention, can create monsters. The electroshock therapy he received at age 9, the institutional abuse, the complete absence of stable, loving relationships, all of these factors contributed to the development of a person incapable of normal human empathy. But we must also remember that many people suffer terrible childhoods without becoming killers. While Biegenwald's early experiences help us understand how his mind developed, they don't excuse the choices he made as an adult. At some point, he became responsible for his actions, regardless of what had shaped him. What makes the thrill killer particularly disturbing is the randomness of his violence. His victims weren't chosen because of who they were or what they had done. They were simply in the wrong place when Biegenwald felt the urge to kill. This randomness makes his crimes especially terrifying because they remind us that evil can strike without warning or reason. The Jersey Shore community, particularly around Asbury Park, still remembers the terror that Biegenwald brought to their streets in the early 1980s. Parents who lived through that period still carry the memory of warning their children to be extra careful, of checking locks twice, of feeling that familiar chill when someone they knew failed to come home on time. Today, Richard Biegenwald's name serves as a reminder of the capacity for evil that exists in our world, but also of the importance of law enforcement's dedication to protecting innocent people from predators who see human life as dispensable. That brings us to the end of today's episode of Dark Waters. The story of Richard Biegenwald, known as the Thrill Killer, is a chilling reminder of how ordinary faces can hide unimaginable darkness. Though Biegenwald is gone, the lives he destroyed, Anna Olasiewicz, Maria Chialella, Deborah Osborne, William Ward, Betsy Bacon, and Stephen Sladowski, must never be forgotten. But this case raises a haunting question. How many warning signs were missed, and could these murders have been stopped sooner? The answers reveal a disturbing side of justice, psychology, and human blindness that few ever talk about. If this story left you unsettled, there's much more beneath the surface. Download the Skoob app now to unlock the full story, deeper insights, and exclusive episodes that go beyond what you've heard here. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and remember, evil doesn't always look like a monster. This is Arthur Morgan. We'll meet again in the shadows.